As we move into the lean and agile world, the terminology changes, and it changes for a reason. It changes to express something different that the word requirement avoids. Actually, the word requirement kind of conjures up the image of it has to be that way. That's all there is. For many, many years, those of us in the software industry have always looked at the requirement as being a request from somebody who has the authority to make the request. But because the word requirement sounds so solid, a lot of people get hung up on it or get, rightfully convinced that it has to be that way because it says it's a requirement. That word itself says everything. Actually, when we move into the lean or agile world, we have different words that are much more flexible and not as fixed on the absolute outcome. Features is a very good one. This comes in particular, is used particularly heavily in the lean environment. If you're using a Kanban methodology for developing software, you're going to run into a feature list, feature files, things like that. And features in this context, well, a lot of organizations use the word features to mean a low-level function, a function that the developer can get, like we were talking earlier about calculate total sales taxes. That's something that a developer could actually implement. They could write the program, write the app, and test it, prove that it works, and be done. Other organizations use the features at a much higher level. However your organization uses the term, there is no consistency, so you can never be inconsistent in the use of the term feature. It's something that is going to be observable, that's going to be provable about the application or the usage of the application that you are developing. Another word that is used in conjunction with agile requirements is user stories, and I've given you the example in the stakeholder requirement of what a good user story is. Actually, the term user stories doesn't originate with Agile. It comes from a predecessor methodology called XP or Extreme Programming, where they came up with the idea that, as a developer, what I really need to know is, what does the user expect the application to do? Just tell me briefly, and we're going to collect them, and then we're going to analyze them later. We're going to analyze them, take them apart, and really understand them when we're ready to start writing code. The whole concept of user stories has a comparatively long history in the world of Agile. And it is also very often used in the lean approach as well. Quite often what I see in organizations implementing is they have a feature, which is the lean construct, and in order to understand the feature, the developer gets the end users or the people that are the appropriate stakeholders to write user stories explaining how that feature is going to be implemented. And then they use the user story as their guideline for coding. Business rules is a concept that spans both traditional and agile/lean methodologies. Now, business rules as an approach, there's a whole science behind that, and we'll talk about that a little later on when we get into how to write effective requirements or how to write these statements. But business rules are statements that express how the organization wants to function. A good business rule might be, we will offer a 10% discount to customers living within 100 miles of our store. That would be a legitimate business rule. It expresses something that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with automation, but if you're going to automate anything, you have to take the business rules into account. Constraints. Constraints are a category of themselves. A constraint is an externally imposed absolute limit to what an application can or cannot do, or what the people who are using the application can or cannot do. We're going to talk about constraints also in more detail. You're going to see there are legal constraints, there are environmental constraints, there are human or people constraints based upon the talents and the skill levels of the end users. Examples is also a great way of expressing requirements in a lean or agile world. Actually, even in a traditional world, examples were a great way of getting to requirements because a concrete example makes life specific. It gives you something, it's not as abstract, it's concrete, and it gives me something to work with. So instead of telling me what a sales tax is, show me. Show me an example of an invoice where you have a total amount in a sales tax and I can see it's 7%. It makes it very clear as to what it is you're trying to achieve. So requirement by example is another very good method for getting requirements in a lean or agile world. Use cases. Use cases is another one of these constructs or concepts that span traditional and agile/lean environments. Actually, if I'm writing use cases, I could write use cases at a very high level of detail, which would be business use cases or even conceptual use cases that explain how people are going to utilize an application. From a developer perspective, use cases are typically a much lower level of detail, showing how a specific piece of code is going to be used by the end users. Now, the key word, we're talking about use cases as a requirements concept, the key word is interaction. Use cases show interaction between an external and the application that is in use. That external thing is usually called an actor in use case parlance, and it shows people and or other applications interacting with the application that you're developing. It's a great way of expressing very detailed interaction between two entities that are forming the application. Finally, we have a thing called test scenarios. Now again, test scenarios span traditional and agile universes, but what test scenarios are situations that we are going to create in order to validate whether or not the application does what I think it should do. In the world of Agile in particular, and Lean, we have a concept called acceptance test-driven development, or behavior-driven development, or behavior-driven design. And these concepts basically say that in order to get the code to do what we want it to do, we're not going to start by taking a vague requirement or an abstract concept. We're going to actually develop the tests first. And because of that, we're going to be able to run the test. We have the tests, and all we have to do is write the code that will pass the tests. A very efficient and a very effective way of delivering or developing software. This led us into a concept where we have automated testing tools. That's the acceptance test-driven development requires automated tools. And one of the very popular ones is Cucumber. It uses a language called Gherkin. And the Gherkin language construct, the primary one, is called the given, when, then constructs. Expressing the requirements in the form of given, when, then statements gives the developers a level of detail they could never get out of a requirement statement that says, oh, this is what the end user wants. Now, these are the kinds of things that we're dealing with when we're talking about the Agile world. Features, user stories, business rules, constraints, examples, use cases, and test scenarios. And they're all legitimate forms of expressing requirements or pass for requirements because they define what the business community wants the application to do.